Watch out, Analog, there's a new contender in town. And this one is open source. This is the GameBub, an impressive FPGA-based handheld. Today I'm taking on this rather ambitious build and making one from scratch. All this and more coming up on this episode of What's Ken Making. Among the never-ending stream of software emulation handhelds, it's nice to see a new hardware emulator, and particularly one that's open source. In the past, I've taken a look at the Analog Pocket, the Mod Retro Chromatic, the funny playing Game Boy Color, and of course my very own DIY Mr. Handheld. But today we're going to dive in and build one of the newest FPGA handhelds out there, the GameBub. The GameBub was created by an engineer named Eli Lipsitz over a 1 to 2 year period. Eli's initial design was a vertical layout, and though he designed it from the ground up, it looks like a close cousin to the Analog Pocket. Revision 3 of the GameBub switched over to a horizontal layout, and that version officially launched with a fully funded crowd supply project in the fall of 2025. Now, there's no better way to get to know a device than to make one yourself. However, at the time I'm filming this in late 2025, Eli hasn't yet released the open source hardware files for the horizontal version. I chatted with him about it, and he did confirm that they will be released when the crowd supply orders start shipping. But the design for the vertical version has been available for quite a while. So for now, we're going to do the next best thing and build revision 2 of the GameBub. Now, as you know, we can't build any electronics project without a PCB, but thankfully, we have some that were provided by this video sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay offers high-quality PCBs in a variety of options and colors. For the GameBub, I opted to go with a black solder mask, which looks really cool with the ENIG finish. Since the FPGA is in a fine-pitch BGA package, the gold finish helps keep the pads even. Otherwise, there's a risk of some of the solder balls not fully attaching. Another interesting thing about this PCB is that it uses filled vias, and that's because the GameBub has vias beneath some of the pads. If you don't get those filled in with resin, the solder could be wicked away from the pad and into the via, and that would be bad, because you want that solder to stay on top of the board, making contact with the BGA chip. Now, for this project, I also needed an enclosure. So I ordered this high-quality 3D printed shell in PCBWay's UTR 8100 transparent resin. And I have to say, when compared to the one I printed at home, there's no contest. PCBWay's enclosure is much more polished. A big thanks goes out to PCBWay for sponsoring this video and for providing these boards. Be sure to order your high-quality PCBs and 3D printed parts from PCBWay.com. Alright, now that we have our PCB, we need some chips and some additional components. There are quite a few parts for this project. I'll take you through the main pieces, but you can get a full parts list from Eli's GitHub repository, which is linked in this video's description. To start, we have the heart of the GameBub, a Xilinx Arctic 7 FPGA with 100,000 logic cells. It's always challenging to compare FPGAs from two different manufacturers because the design of their logic units differs. But you could say that one Xilinx logic cell is roughly equivalent to a Cyclone logic element. So if you were to use that as a gauge, then the GameBub's FPGA is roughly twice as capable as the Cyclone 5 inside the Analog Pocket. Now, 100,000 logic cells is a lot. In fact, the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance cores that Eli wrote only take up a fraction of the available capacity on this chip. I fully expect that many of the open source Mr. cores could be ported over to run on this device. There's also an ESP32 mini microcontroller, which works alongside the FPGA to to run the operating system. Eli wrote the OS in Ruby, and as you'll see shortly, the UI is very responsive. We'll take a closer look at it when we get the GameBub up and running. Now, the GameBub uses a 320 by 480 ILI 9488 LCD, which interfaces directly with the FPGA. It uses the 18-bit parallel RGB interface, but rather than streaming the data directly, it's first doing some processing. You see, the GameBub's LCD natively supports portrait mode, but the screen is physically rotated and laid out in landscape mode on the device. Because of that, a frame buffer is unfortunately needed in order to rotate the image. Thankfully though, the FPGA easily handles this task before streaming out the pixel data. When the microcontroller wants to use the screen for drawing the menu, it sends it line by line over to the FPGA, which then renders it on the LCD. But you'll also notice that the MCU is directly connected to the LCD over SPI. This is used for initializing the LCD and as a fallback mode, which allows the ESP32 to display an error message if the bitstream can't be loaded. For audio, the GameBub has both built-in speakers and supports headphones. It uses a Texas Instruments TLV320 digital to analog converter, which is the same DAC that's used in Mod Retro's Chromatic. As far as DACs are concerned, this one is actually pretty nice. Not only does it support both headphones and stereo speakers with a built-in amplifier, it also has a ton of configuration options that can be set by the ESP32 over I2C. And for the digital audio signal, the DAC communicates directly with the FPGA over I2S. The task of collecting button presses is shared between both the FPGA and the microcontroller. The ESP32 directly reads and processes the home and volume buttons, which are used universally for calling the in-game menu screen and controlling the volume. The buttons used for gameplay, however, all run through an I/O expander chip from Texas Instruments called the TCA9535. This chip captures the button presses in parallel, triggers an interrupt, and then sends them to the microcontroller over I2C. But alongside of that, the gameplay buttons are also connected directly to the FPGA. This allows the core to read the buttons in real time, similar to how a real Game Boy or Game Boy Advance would do. There's also a microSD card slot included, which is used by the microcontroller. When you turn the GameBub on, the MCU will read the boot up bitstream from the microSD card and send it over to the FPGA. And when you run a game, the MCU will grab the appropriate Game Boy or Game Boy Advance bitstream from the card and load that up onto the FPGA. In addition to that, the microSD card also stores the BIOS files for the Game Boy Advance cores, alongside of all your Game Boy and Game Boy Advance ROM files. And for ROMs that support saves, the saved game files are also kept on the microSD card. In order for the GameBub to load a ROM, it needs to keep the game image in memory. And for that, it uses a 32 megabyte SD-RAM chip from WinBond. When you load a ROM, the data is copied into this chip, and the FPGA reads from it instead of the cartridge. There's also a 512 kilobyte SRAM chip on board, which serves two purposes. First, the lower 256 kilobytes are used for cartridge RAM when you're running a ROM. And the upper 256 kilobytes are used by the Game Boy Advance core as external work RAM. For the battery, the GameBub uses a standard 3.7 volt LiPo. Charging is handled by a Texas Instruments BQ24073 charge controller. This chip has power path management built in, so it's designed to both charge the battery while independently powering the device. Alongside it, there's also a MAX 17048 fuel gauge, which is used to report the status of the battery to the microcontroller. This is what provides the depletion percentage, the current voltage, and the charge and discharge rate of the battery. Alright, I'm excited to get this thing together. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, there are a lot of components for this build. In hindsight, I wish I'd ordered these boards partially assembled, because there are over 300 parts, and 270 of them are passives that would have been fairly inexpensive to get pre-stuffed. But for some reason, I decided to do this whole thing by hand. Now, the GameBub uses 0402 components, which are really small and challenging to work with. So when assembling a board like this by hand, you really need a solder paste stencil. This will make sure that the solder paste goes exactly where you want it. Otherwise, you're going to have a ton of cleanup on the board. The main thing with the stencil is to keep it flat against the PCB and make sure it doesn't move. So to help with that, I made this 3D printed jig. The GameBub PCB rests in the cutout, and this stencil just gets taped to the jig to keep it from moving. Once everything's lined up, we just take some solder paste and spread it across the stencil. After all the holes are completely filled, we can remove it and start placing components. I'll start by laying out all the passive components first. This includes the capacitors, resistors, an inductor, and a few diodes. In case you're curious, there are 271 of these passive components. Next, I'll place down the chips. And when I do, I'm paying extra special attention to their orientation and making sure that they're positioned correctly. You'll notice that I'm going to skip over the FPGA and place down that chip last. You'll see why in a moment. We also have a few buttons to place down. And we also have some MOSFETs. And we can't forget the microSD card slot, the USB-C port, the LCD connector, and the headphone jack. Okay, that's everything on the top side of the board that I'm going to reflow, except for the FPGA. And for that, I'm going to wipe away the solder paste. That's because the FPGA already has solder balls attached to the chip. So instead, I'm just going to put down a little flux and line up the chip as best as I can. Now for reflowing, I'm going to use my T962 reflow oven. An oven isn't strictly necessary. You could reflow this on a hot plate and it would be fine. The advantage of using an oven, though, is that it can use temperature curves to preheat the board and reflow the solder according to the manufacturer's recommendations. After about 7 minutes, the board's all done, and it's looking pretty good. Alright, that takes care of most of the topside components, but there is one more that needs to be hand soldered, and that's this small vibration motor. I just trimmed down the wires, and then they solder onto these two pads here. The vibration motor itself has some adhesive on the back, and that sticks down onto this circle here labeled rumble motor. Alright, now we need to hand solder the components on the back of the board. We'll start with the cartridge connector, which works for both Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. Then we'll solder on the cartridge detection switch. This mechanism determines which type of cartridge is inserted, so it knows which Game Boy core to launch. We also have two shoulder buttons, and of course there's the JST connector for the battery. And the last piece is the link port, which is the only through-hole component on the whole board. Okay, let's go ahead and mount it into the case. You'll notice the enclosure is a little warped, and that's just the nature of this type of print when there's some thin areas on the piece. It's nothing to worry about though. The case will get straightened out and joined together nicely when it's all buttoned up. We'll first use some CA glue to attach the 4mm M2.5 threaded inserts to the front half of the enclosure. After that cures, we can then install the panel that covers the LCD. Now, Eli had an extra piece of glass that he just sent over to me, so I'll be installing that. But if you're making one of these yourself, another suitable option is to make your own out of a thin piece of acrylic. We can then mount the LCD into the front half of the enclosure, making sure that the ribbon cable is oriented to the right. Next, we place the two speakers into the rectangular cavities, but you'll need to make sure the spring contacts are facing inwards so they rest against the pads on the PCB. We'll then place in our 3D printed buttons, followed by our button membranes. Then we can connect the ribbon cable to the LCD connector. After that, we just need to line up the board and use 3 5mm screws to hold it into place against the front enclosure. We'll set the front half of the enclosure aside for a minute and take out the back half. The first thing we'll do is use some double-sided adhesive to mount the 3000 mAh battery into the lower half of the shell. Then we'll need to install the shoulder buttons. These slip in through the hole, and then we'll insert a spring and pin it down with a little metal dowel pin. And the other end of the spring hooks onto this clip inside the shell. Okay, now we can go back to the front enclosure and connect up the battery. We'll also need to insert the side buttons into the front. And finally, we can close it up with 2 5mm screws up top and 4 14mm screws in the middle and bottom of the shell. And that's it. I have to say that this came together nicely. I really like the feel of this transparent resin shell. It's very comfortable to hold. For reference, here's the vertical GameBub side by side with the analog pocket. The GameBub's a little shorter and wider than the pocket, but it's also quite a bit thinner. And I have to say that it feels so much better to hold than the analog pocket does. One of my main complaints about the pocket is the sharp edges where the front and back join together. We don't have that problem with the GameBub. The rounded edges, coupled with the slightly wider grip, really makes it feel nice. But we're not done yet. Before we can turn it on, we need to program it. And that consists of 2 steps. First, we need to load up a micro SD card with the necessary files. We'll need to create 2 folders, one called ROMs and the other called System. Now you can probably guess what goes into the ROMs folder, but for the System folder, we'll need to copy in the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance BIOS files. And we'll also need to copy in the bit streams, which we'll download from the GameBub's GitHub project. There should be 3 in total. The boot bit stream is what gets used when the GameBub is first turned on before you load up a game. But the Game Boy and GBA bit streams are the actual cores that are used when you load a game. Next, we'll need to set up the Rust toolchain for ESP32 microcontrollers. Then we'll install the ESP up utility, followed by ESP Flash. Then we can just plug the GameBub into the computer and hold down the center button while turning it on. If that worked, you should now see the GameBub listed as a USB device. Now, I'm using the Windows subsystem for Linux to compile and load the firmware. So I first need to bind the GameBub's USB port to my Linux instance. Once that's done, I can then go into WSL and run the commands to flash the firmware. And with a little luck, it should reboot and we'll see the main menu. Okay, as you can see, we have a few different options. Let's first go into the Tools menu and select Debug Battery Info. You can see that it correctly detects that the GameBub is plugged in and charging. And when I unplug it, VBus is disconnected, and the battery status changes to show that it's no longer charging. So that all looks to be working well. Okay, let's try out some games. I'll start off by inserting a standard Game Boy cartridge, and we'll select Run Cartridge from the main menu. As you can see, it runs the cartridge in Game Boy Color mode by default. But we can change that by going into the main menu and setting the option called Enable DMG Mode. And the game looks to be running fine. It's using a 2x integer scale, so there's a small black pixel border around the top and bottom edges. But one thing that I don't really like is that there's no option to change the color palette. Personally, I like having that ugly green color profile when I'm playing original Game Boy games. But despite that, I think it looks great. Okay, now let's run a Game Boy Color game. But before we do, we need to disable the DMG mode that we put it in earlier. This time, I'm going to try loading a ROM file from the microSD card. You can see there's a nice file browser here, and you'll notice that you can organize your ROM library into whatever folder structure you'd like. And for this test, I'm going to try a feature of the GameBub that no other FPGA handheld supports, and that's the accelerometer. Games like Kirby Tilt and Tumble included the accelerometer inside the cartridge. So if you want to play this game on any other handheld, you need the original cartridge. Otherwise, you need to use a patched version of the ROM that removes the accelerometer support and replaces it with the D-pad. But since there's an accelerometer inside the GameBub, you can play Kirby Tilt and Tumble with the accelerometer as it was intended. And if you've never had the pleasure of playing this game by maneuvering the device, you're really missing out. And of course, we need to try out a Game Boy Advance cartridge. This is where that cartridge detector switch comes into play. Unlike the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, GBA cartridges are all notched, so the switch can detect which type of game cart you've inserted. One major difference you'll notice right away is that the entire screen is used. GBA games also run with 2x integer scaling, so its native 240 by 160 pixel display fills this LCD nicely. And audio also sounds great with the two front-facing speakers. But there is an issue that I found with this version of the Game Boy Advance bitstream. Cartridge games all work fine, but when I load the same game as a ROM file, the GameBub runs at about 96% of the speed. You can see here that I have Mario Kart running on both the GameBub and my screen-modded Game Boy Advance, and after 2 minutes, the clocks are off by about 5 seconds. Now, fortunately, this can all be fixed in software. I talked with Eli about it, and he's already addressed the problem in the bitstream that's releasing with the crowd supply orders. I don't have access to this code yet, so I can't recompile it for the vertical version, but the updated bitstream should be available when Eli releases the Revision 3 updates. Overall though, I have to say I'm really impressed with the GameBub. Eli put a lot of work into this. It's quite amazing that this entire thing, including both the hardware and software, was developed by one person. And I love that it's open source. Not only does it enable anyone with the right tools to build one, but having the open platform means that we'll surely see other people building FPGA cores for it. Now, should you build one of your own? Well, unless you really want a vertical GameBub, I'm going to recommend against it. And that's due to a couple of factors. First, this is an expensive device to build as a one-off. Each unit cost me over $200 to make, and that wasn't including shipping, tariff charges, or the cost of my time to assemble them. But the other factor is the complexity of this build. There are over 300 components that need to be soldered, along with a BGA chip. I think that's beyond the capability of most hobbyists to build in their home workshops. But as I've demonstrated in this video, if your skills are up to par and you really want to build one, it is possible. But instead of building one yourself, I would recommend ordering a pre-made GameBub from Eli's crowd supply project. In doing so, you'll get the horizontal version, which has a few improvements over this revision 2 design. I haven't had a chance to look at that version yet, but I'll definitely be coming back with another video on that device when I'm able to get my hands on one. I want to give a big thanks to Eli for not only bringing us a brilliant open source handheld FPGA platform, but for also answering my many questions and sending me some of his extra screen covers so I didn't have to go make my own. And a huge thank you to PCBWay as well for sponsoring this video. If you're planning an electronics project, be sure to grab your boards from PCBWay. By supporting them, you're also supporting this channel. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, I'm now on Patreon. If you want to help me continue making content like this, please check out my Patreon tiers and consider supporting me there. The link is in this video's description. Alright, that's all I have for today, so I'll see you next time. But, as always, until then, go make something cool.